Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar curated by the Organization for Research on China in Asia, titled The Contemporary Resonance of India-China Cultural Exchanges. My name is Ratish Mehta. I am a research associate at ORCA. On behalf of the organization, I am extremely delighted to welcome all of you, along with our distinguished panelists, for an insightful discussion on the stories and narrative of exchanges that have shaped India-China relations. From their civilizational roots to contemporary soft power contestations and the delicate balance between cultural interactions and geopolitical realities are among the some themes that we'll be digging deeper into today. Before we begin, I would like to quickly take some note on some housekeeping rules. Participants attending the event will not be able to unmute themselves until the Q&A session. Questions during that round can be asked in two ways. First, by raising your hand using the raise hand option at the Zoom control panel, upon which you will be called upon to ask your question. Second is by typing your question in the chat box, which will of course open during the Q&A session. Today's discussion on the contemporary resonance of India-China cultural relations is part of ORCA's ongoing project, episodes of India-China exchanges, modern bridges, and resident connections, led by senior research associate Rahul Karan Reddy and myself, with support from research assistants at Flame University. Project seeks to document and creatively retell stories of India-China cultural interactions, both historic and contemporary, with an emphasis on overlooked vectors of cultural connectivity. The sorts of exchanges such as Sikh and Tamil communities in China, Confucius institutes and sister city agreements in India, and many more have highlighted how cultural exchanges have played a crucial role in promoting connections over time. Looking ahead, future episodes, which release every week, will dive deeper into the fascinating relationship between contemporary cultural linkages and the broader tension that influence them today. When we speak of India China relations, the conversation more generally gravitates towards geopolitics, economic competition, and border tensions. However, underlying these more visible dynamics is a deep and enduring layer of civilizational interactions, one that has shaped both societies in many different ways. These exchanges are not just relics of the past. Today, they have manifested in different forms, from digital entertainment, educational exchanges, to cinematic and evolving diasporic linkages. Each vector of cultural exchange presents a deeper yet a different picture of bilateral ties. The influence of Chinese video games in India, for example, represents a contemporary form of cultural engagement that has influenced geopolitical consideration based out of the interaction. Aspects such as narrative control, market influence, and even soft power dynamics have taken the priority during tensions in this regard. To explore these themes in greater depth, I am delighted to be joined by three distinguished speakers who share immense expertise on the theme of today's discussion. Firstly, we have Dr. Bali Deepak, a professor of Chinese studies at Jawaharlal Nehru University, a leading scholar in India-China relations, with multiple publication and prestigious recognition, including the China Special Book Award. His expertise spans across historical and contemporary dimensions of India-China ties. We also have with us Dr. Gunjan Singh, Associate Professor at the OP Jindal Global University. He is a scholar specializing in Chinese foreign policy, China-South Asia relations, and space security. She has been associated with leading think tanks like ICWA, ICS, and IDSA, and has contributed extensively to academic and policy discussions specifically pertaining to China-India relations. The third panelist for today is Mr. Rahul Karan Reddy, Senior Research Associate at ORCA, and my co-lead on the episodes of India-China Exchange Project. Rahul focuses on domestic Chinese politics, trade, and data-driven research. He has authored a monograph named Island on the Rocks and has developed innovative dashboards analyzing India-China trade and Chinese provincial data. Before I invite our esteemed panelists to share their insights, I would like to set the stage with a few key points. At the heart of today's discussion is a fundamental question. How do we understand India-China relations beyond the dominant framework of strategic competition and contested borders? While these aspects undeniably shape our modern engagements, coexist with a deeper and often underappreciated reality, a centuries-old continuum of cultural exchange and people-to-people interaction. It is in this context that ORCA's project, Episodes of India-China Exchanges, takes on critical significance. By tracing both historical and contemporary cultural exchanges, we seek to uncover alternative narratives that challenge one-dimensional portrayals of India-China relations. But why do these stories and episodes even matter? Well, first, they serve as a bridge across time and geography. Transmission of Buddhism, the intellectual journeys of scholars like Shui-Sang, Bodhidharma, and the shared artistic influence on painting, architecture, literature, and even language illustrate how ideas have flown across the Himalayas, enriching both civilizations. Second, narratives of exchange shape perceptions. The way we remember and retell these stories often influence not only academic discussions, but also public sentiment and policy approaches. The more we engage with these shared histories, the more we recognize the depth of interactions beyond immediate political frictions. Third, and of much more immediate consequence, these cultural exchanges function as an instrument of soft power. In an era where nations compete not just through economic or military means, but through their ability to project cultural and intellectual influence, the way India and China narrate their historical exchanges has real geopolitical implications. As we begin this discussion, I invite our esteemed panelists to reflect not only on the historical dimension of India China exchange, but also on their contemporary resonance. How do these stories shape modern interactions? How can they be leveraged to build more meaningful and constructive ties? What are the challenges in ensuring that these exchanges continue to play a positive role in India's soft power influence? With that, I look forward to an enriching conversation. I would like to call upon our first speaker, Dr. Bali Deepak, to present his remarks. I would request all the speakers to contain their remarks to 10 to 12 minutes, post which we'll be moving on to the next speaker and ultimately do the question answer round. Dr. Deepak, the floor is all yours.
Thank you, Ritesh, and thank you, ORCA, for organizing this wonderful discussion. In fact, very rare, that people are talking about people-to-people contacts, and I hope with fellow panelists we'll have enriching discussion. I'll primarily focus on the civilizational part, of course. In passing, I'll also refer to the modern and contemporary issues, but largely it would be focused on civilizational interconnectedness. In fact, I had prepared my PPT, but I thought in order to save time, I'll just not use that. But largely it would be on the lines what I did in the PPT. I'll make three larger assumptions. The first is India as a knowledge production center in the ancient times, and so was the case of China. I think spiritually, of course, we influenced China more than what China influenced us, but of course that was balanced by material linkages between China. The second is dissemination of Indian cultural capital. It enriched China's culture and civilization, and I say that no wonder Indian blood runs deep in China's cultural genes. Only thing that we have to discover, and unfortunately, my Chinese friends, they also don't discover that. And the third is, though India's civilizational linkages with China, they have been termed glorious and benevolent, largely by our leadership. I think it is also the case of use and misuse of these glorious linkages or interconnectedness. But I think there were aberrations too, there were problems between India and China, even during the ancient times. I think as far as India being the cultural or the knowledge production center, I will not delve into the university network which we had in India, ranging from Takshila to Shardapir to Nalanda to Adantpura to Bikramshila to Balvi, Varanasi, Kanchipuram, so on and so forth. If you see, the north, east, west, and even south, it was well connected, and the kind of bibliography that we had in Nalanda, it was 9 million, and we had almost 10,000 students, including foreign students like Xuanzang, Yijing, Parsians of these people, so they all were there. And on the Chinese side, again, if you see, that trajectory of historical records. So right from the first historical record by Sima Qian, the records of the historian, then Panku as Han history, and then Wei Jin and Northern and Southern dynasty. It was the period when the Buddhism flourished in China, primarily because of these northern tribes, not because of the mainstream Han culture. And then you have Tang Dynasty, and then Ming annals, and also during Qing Dynasty we have sources on diplomatic history of late Qing. So these are equally important sources, and if you see these sources and the kind of data which is enshrined in these sources and compile it with the Indian data, whether it is our epics, Mahabharata, Ramayana, or Kautilya, the Arthashastra, Manusmriti, so on and so forth. So you'll find there is a linkage and are interconnected, as so it goes into before Christ in the 2nd century BC. But I think at the center of this interconnectedness was the circulatory movement, which I called, because it was not linear exchange between India and China. It was the circulatory movement, whether it was ideas, technology, commodities, and people. So it moved into that motion, not only enriching the Chinese culture and civilization, but also the nearby polities in the process. And I think I'll just give you one example of the kind of translation it happened during that point in time. It was unprecedented in history. Perhaps nowhere in the global stage was such an unprecedented translation industry founded. And we can see that from 1st century AD to 8th century AD, in the year of in almost 800 years, 185 prominent scholar monks, I call them. So they translated 2,412 sutras in 7,352 fascicles, which was immense. And there were many scholars who translated more than 100 sutras, and some like Xuanza, more than 1,000. Kumarjiva was one who translated more than 400. So this is one thing, and it was in the process of this translation of Buddhist sutras, that Indian culture capital directly and indirectly, Chinese scholarship, they call it conscious and unconscious translation of Indian culture capital into China, or dissemination of culture capital into China. Consciously, we see the Buddhist text being translated. Unconsciously, we will see that many Indian knowledge systems, whether they are literature, astronomy, medicine, theater, so on and so forth, they were also translated into Chinese language, including commentaries on Vedas and other knowledge systems of India. I think I will not go through into that. But this cultural capital of India, I think it was balanced by Chinese material capital into India. So, for example, if you see sugar, of course, there is also a case of Indian sugar going to China, but then refined sugar, during Ming Dynasty coming back to India. And so is the case of paper manufacturing technique, and so is the case of silk manufacturing technique and their dissemination into India and various others. I think I'll not go into detail. If you are interested, I think you can go through. This is one of my translations. It's a quite bulky book, around maybe 700 plus pages. It's titled China and India, Dialogue of Civilizations. And also Professor Chi Xianlin, who was awarded Padma Bhushan by Indian government. So his works on sugar in 2 volumes, and various translations he did pertaining to Indian culture capital. I think another thing I would emphasize is that this tradition of sutra translation has been continued by the Chinese scholarship. And I don't buy the argument that Chinese scholarship or the Chinese intellectuals, so they are not aware about India. I think their awareness about India is much more than what we know about, the Chinese culture, tradition, and even translation of Chinese, classics and various other things. Um, and of course there were aberrations also in the middle of this exchange. We know about regime changes in Kashmir. That time it used to be known as Chipin. We know about regime change in Kannauj during Harshvardhana's time, and various other regime changes in subcontinent, including Southeast Asia. I think I'll not delve into that. But I think what is important to understand is the kind of images, perceptions we have built about each other. It was during colonial period. And I think that's why the colonial connections between India and China, so they are important, especially with the British expansionism in Tibet and China's expansionism in also Tibet and Xinjiang. So it occurred almost at the same period in time. And as China got suspicious of British India, so they sent officials like Huang Maocai, like Ma Jianzhong, like Wu Guangpei to India, British India at that time. And these people, so they have left their diaries and notes and this kind of suspicion which they have towards British. So it is clearly written. And you can go through the travelogues of Kang Youwei, now commercial, Professor Commercial, they have translated them into English, and also Lu Xun, the kind of you can say approaches he had towards Tagore. So they are also very, very important and very negative also. But I will not go through into these because I think if there were negativity during the colonial period between India and China, there were camaraderie also. If you look into some of my chapters pertaining to Taiping Rebellion and how the Indian soldier deployed in China, so they switched over to the Taipings, nationalists, Indian nationalists and Chinese nationalists in Japan and China, and also the kind of camaraderie they had between themselves during the Second World War, especially during the War of Resistance against Japanese aggression. The last couple of minutes, I think my time is getting over. So why civilizational dialogue? I think one, of course, we have to rediscover our past. And I think it is extremely important because in India, forget about general public intellectuals, so they also know very, very little about this interconnectedness, or maybe very superficial understanding about the interconnectedness. As Chi Xianlin, I am a great admirer of Professor Chi Xianlin. So he said that this civilizational dialogue or people-to-people exchange, it has only advantages, no disadvantages. But at the same time, he says that creation of the cultural history of mankind is a collective effort. And we have to recognize this fact. And recognition of this fact will bring great benefits that can enhance friendship and understanding between the two people. Now, there are issues affecting this dialogue between two. Of course, the lost equilibrium and widening asymmetries is, one thing. And as long I think that rebalancing doesn't happen between India and China, so that China looking down upon India syndrome, I think it will continue for some times to come. But at the same time, I think people-to-people exchange is the foundation of dialogue between any countries or nation. But in order to in order to facilitating this dialogue, the resolution of the thorny issues between two countries is also important. And we have seen, I think we can take cues from the past, for example, in 1947, during Asian Relation Conference, cultural cooperation was one of the agendas. But then you can see, the map issue during the Asian Relation Conference created a lot of controversy and mistrust between India and China. And similarly, when the first Indian delegation headed by the Sunderlal went to China, of course, now it is there for everyone to see in the Nehru papers. So they are in public domain. The kind of speeches he gave in China, I think that was also a little problematic and put India in a difficult situation. In 1956, again, we see, the writer Mao Tun, So when he comes to India with a literary delegation, but we should remember that he was the same person who was at the forefront of opposing Tagore's visit in 1924. And then 1962, we know, and there was a hiatus. And recently, during the Galwan crisis, you can see entire people-to-people exchange between India and China. It came to a grinding halt, including the government projects, which we had signed. I was heading one of the projects, this mutual translation project. So it is still in limbo. I have written to Ministry of External Affairs, NBT, and other executing agencies. But then I think it is one of the casualties of the people-to-people exchanges between India and China. Therefore, I think the trade only, which I have also highlighted in various other writings, it doesn't augur well for a rising India. I think we have to holistically think about people-to-people exchanges between two countries, and perhaps that has to be worked out at policy level by the think tanks and organizations like ORCA, and perhaps feedback should be given to various government agencies that so this is what the intellectuals and perhaps the country should be adopting a kind of policy which is not halted by a knee-jerk reaction like 2020 Galvan. I think with these comments, I'll stop myself here. I'm sorry for overshooting the time.
Those are some very compelling remarks, Dr. Deepak. I think we'll be touching upon many of those during the Q&A session. I would encourage all our participants to engage with Dr. Deepak's book on the topic, which of course will be of great interest to many. The link of the book can be found in the chat box in case anyone is interested. With that, I would like to call upon the Singh to present her remarks, and then we'll move towards Rahul.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Ratish, for inviting me, and thank you, Professor Deepak, for setting the tone, like the civilizational bit and how things were and what can happen in the future, and how we need to actually focus more on people-to-people interaction. And as I was talking to Ratish before, that the people-to-people interaction is where we are lacking primarily. There's very less information. There's obviously the geopolitics that clouds how we look at China or what the Chinese are doing. So the inherent mistrust is very difficult to overcome. Maybe it'll take, obviously, a lot of effort needs to be done in order to channelize effort in the right direction to mitigate these roadblocks. Thanks for inviting me, ORCA, for organizing this session. Very rarely we get to speak about soft power of India, China, and especially contestations in Southeast Asia and South Asia. It's a very difficult and a vast topic that is given to me, honestly, and I've been trying to figure out how to comprise or condense it in 10 to 12 minutes. You guys are very particular about timing, comes from experience. So I'll try not to ramble on. Please stop me if I do, and I hope I'm able to express my thoughts in a more coherent manner. There are just too many things to talk about. Soft power, let's begin with what is soft power. Over time, we've seen that the definition has evolved, right? From Joseph Nye to today, there are multiple factors that are getting included in from, generally, I think soft power should be something which is not top-down, which is not primarily pushed by the government, and should be naturally accepted by countries, neighbors, and people you interact with, right? It shouldn't be seen as a carrot and stick kind of a thing, should not follow with soft power kind of a thing. Like the American soft power, I always give this example that we trust the Americans the most, but it's just how they've projected themselves, barring the fact they're the global superpower and they can arm twist you at any given time. But still, there's a lot of influence that the Americans have managed to have. So soft power, let's look at the Indian advantages that we have. Obviously, looking at the region that we're talking about, South Asia and Southeast Asia, democracy definitely plays in our favor. We're a vibrant, largest democracy in the world, have been successful in a very large extent. Cultural, obviously, religious tolerance, the birthplace of Buddhism, all this feeds very positively for India, and it can be very attractive for the countries. And economic as well. South Asia, we are a bigger power. We do provide aid. Even in Southeast Asia, the trade is going. The Act East policy has helped us to look for more avenues to interact with the region. If you look at most of the Southeast Asian countries, culturally, we have a very good connection, especially Indonesia. I was reading a lot of Mahabharata, Ramayana, pretty big. With Vietnam also, we have a lot of Buddhist linkages, and Buddhism can be a tool to bridge this gap, especially with Southeast Asia as well. Education, we are, at least when it comes to South Asian students, India is the biggest hub for their destination. Though there are challenges which we'll come to later, but definitely for South Asian students looking for better educational avenues, Indian educational institutions have fared very well. The ICCR is another tool by which we do look for collaborations globally. Media, definitely Bollywood plays a big role when it comes to interacting or projecting India's image, or a very vibrant tool for soft power. China, we look at culture again, Buddhism. Southeast Asia is definitely how Buddhism moved. It moved from India to China and China to Southeast Asia. That's the link which we talk about. So China definitely has a very strong cultural closeness to the Southeast Asian countries. Language, people to people, food, all of these are very close and very similar to China rather than India. So it's definitely at an advantage there. Economic, obviously, China is one of the largest investors today. If you look at Southeast Asia or South Asia, it's the economics that definitely plays a role. Education, the Chinese education institutes have done tremendously well. They rank globally very high. They have projected themselves. They've attracted a lot of students, not only Southeast Asian and South Asian, but definitely Western and European students also look for admission or moving to China. BRI, definitely post 2013-14, BRI has been a major tool. And now definitely they're talking about the GCI, which is the Global Civilizational initiative and stuff, which are definitely will be used as a soft power projection by the Chinese. And the Confucius Institutes, which have a lot of issues, but that has been one of the mandates of the Confucius Institutes to promote language and culture of China. And media, the Chinese media, at least movies, they're trying to get into the space to build a narrative, to project a certain idea of China, how it is. But if we look at if you look at these as platforms, the problems which emerge are in South Asia, India is definitely at an advantage, right? We are here, we have historical connect, we have people to people connect. Most of the countries have people, in the sense, familial connections here, right? We've had that I should say geographical advantage compared to China. China is not, I'll not say a recent entrant, but yeah, a recent entrant in a big way with BRI. Like they're trying to at least look, there's a major contestation that is emerging between India and China now, where China is trying to push its idea with providing aid and other kind of loans to the countries in South Asia with a very distinct plan and policy behind its push here, which has had its disadvantages. India has tried to, I think India has gained a little bit given the narratives that have been built around Hambantota or the recent airport in Gwadar, or how things are, or even the Pokhara airport. Though these aids were done, maybe China agreed to the loans demanded by the people. If you look at it with no, maybe it's very difficult to say no agenda, but definitely the way it's panned out into a debt trap and other thing does give a certain kind of a mistrust among the people, at least, that the Chinese are coming in, or Chinese money does come in with a certain issues. With BRI also, the Chinese money has followed with Chinese people, right? This job creation and other things have followed a certain challenges in other countries which have been the recipient, that there's been no major ground change, and it had led to a certain kind of a negativity attached to the thing. Even the Confucius Institutes, if we look at it, started with a lot of think that it will be the tool for soft power. But the way the narratives built, especially I think the University of Chicago and other places, that it is actually pushing a certain kind of a narrative that the Chinese wanted, the nationalism of the party, which becomes a major key player, tries to push a certain kind of a narrative. So it looks more top down, that this is what you can talk about China, this is what you have to think about China, or any kind of a discussion primarily on issues which were seen as sensitive for China, like Taiwan, Tibet, or Xinjiang, were barred under this thing. And teachers were definitely appointed by the party, so there's no freewheeling of assimilation, there's no criticism, or there's no discussion per se it's allowed. A certain narrative is built and a certain narrative has been pushed. And I think that has become a major challenge in India as well. Though there were a few Confucius institutes, most of them are not functional now because the similar problems with the party getting involved, and then the issues of trust and all that factors do play in. Even I think Xi Jinping had clearly asserted that China should tell its story well, and Chinese will look at or project their soft power in a big way. And they've done that. They have put a lot of money, they're more streamlined. I think generally we hear this thing that the ICCR just has about 37 outlets. I checked on the website today, if I'm mistaken. CI would be about 100 and plus. Infrastructure-wise, money-wise, Chinese are way better. They're more streamlined, they're more organized. They can project an image way better. And given the stories that you guys have put on according to the project as well, if you look at it, the Chinese have invested and they do it. I think how should I say? The packaging is way better than an Indian soft power packaging has ever been. India lacks, like educational institutions are dilapidated. It doesn't give out a good picture. Even in tourism, China is way ahead, right? They've organized it. Chinese tourists are, I think, one of the largest to Southeast Asia and South Asia today. And even their institutions or infrastructures are way better. Like tourists coming here are the biggest, how should I say, people-to-people bridge that could be built, and image building can happen. When you visit a country, you take away a certain kind of an image and an understanding. India has not fared very well. The Indian government, like we lack in infrastructure. Obviously, we lack in other kind of an aspects, which the Chinese have been very well in doing. The way they market it, or the way they have packaged it. So similar with Buddhism as well. The conferences they are organizing or other kind of projects they are pushing is kind of co-opting the whole narrative about it. Indian government has still been very limited in that. But if you look at it, India has been on an advantage, I'll say, at least in Southeast Asia, because we don't have territorial disputes. We are not technically in dispute with any of the nations, right? Though we may not be the largest trader or the largest aid donor or anything, but we don't have territorial disputes, and it's seamless. India is not seen as a threat. India, there's no mistrust. Though we can work on it, we can capitalize it. We should look at it, because soft power is crucial if you want to have a influence amongst the society. We lag there behind, but the only advantage I see we have, which is big, is there's no mistrust. Indian investments and other interactions are not seen with the prism of what if, what is it that they're going to get later? Why are they doing it? These questions don't align. Like we did a supply, I think, BrahMos to Philippines, and we are in talks with Vietnam and other nations. But it's not seen as a tool of aggression or any kind of a big power movement there. It's more co-opted under the fact that it's a developing nation, South-South cooperation. It's a strategic thing. China has major territorial disputes with almost all the nations there. And Xi Jinping has been getting aggressive, and there's a major push of nationalism and core interest and no space. So even if China obviously has a lot of advantages when it comes to soft power there, these things will restrict it. Every action it takes will be perceived from a prism of geopolitics and other kind of thing. And similar we can see in South Asia. India is at an advantage, definitely. We have historical connections and language, culture, Buddhism, religious tolerance and everything. However, we have issues, right? We have, if I don't like using the word big brother, but we are the largest nation, and there will be insecurity in the smaller countries. Even if you don't want to flex your muscles, you are the biggest thing. So they have been looking for outlets with China. But I think China could have gained a lot, the investments and stuff. But the debt trap and other issues have pushed China again in a kind of a cycle. I think the moment you try and weaponize or package it or use soft power, channelize it in a certain way and not let it flow seamlessly, I feel it becomes a problem. India has that advantage. Indians, as I've said, we've lagged behind. We've not used our capabilities, but that has worked in our advantage because it doesn't look like the government is pushing an agenda. Our soft power has been more seamless, more very slow, but whatever we've achieved, we can say is more positive rather than having a top-down agenda which actually doesn't achieve what you wanted it to achieve and leads to a very negative impact at the end of it. Like the CIs and other things led to a lot of mistrust in the countries where it was open, and a lot of issues happened. Also, that's all. It's like if you weaponize it, then there's a problem. We have capabilities, of course. Both countries are at advantage in all regions geographically. South, it's Asian region, historical connection. If you go back, Buddhism, we've had history, but we have disputes as well. And the soft power should be more, I should say, seamless. It should move naturally. There should be a trust. If you weaponize it, if you package it, if you try and push it, then it becomes sharp power, I feel, rather than soft power, because it has a goal, it has a direct agenda, it follows a government narrative, it's not seamless. And that's where I like to stop. There's lots to say, but if there are questions, I'll definitely like to elaborate on the points made. Thank you.
You, Dr. Singh, for that insightful remark. I think you've pointed out quite articulately regarding the contestation that these exchanges can often lead to, and more specifically, how it's playing out in the peripheral neighborhood of both India and China. That also brings us to our next speaker, Rahul Karan Reddy, who will go further into the question of balancing the scales of cultural interactions and geopolitical impulses. Rahul, I would like to ask you to kindly present your remarks.
Thank you, Ratish. First, I want to thank ORCA for this opportunity to speak on this project, speak on this topic. I'm very excited to contribute my thoughts to how the equilibrium of culture and geopolitics is attained, at least in the context of India-China relations. My co-panelists have spoken very persuasively, and it's a pleasure to share the stage with them. Dr. Deepak is an authority on this topic, and he's been very eloquent and precise in his remarks about the historical roots that have shaped relations between India and China. I've heard him speak many times before this, and his breadth and depth of knowledge is incredible. I've heard Dr. Gunjan Singh speak very compellingly at ORCA's Global Conference on New Sinology last year in September on the media and propaganda elements of China's soft power strategy. And Dr. Singh has made some similarly strong arguments today about the soft power contestations between India and China and how it manifests in sub-regions around the world. So following both my co-panelists after they've presented such a comprehensive overview is an exciting prospect. So for my talk today, I'll make some remarks on the dynamics of interaction as they relate to cultural exchanges in the contemporary period, on the one hand, and geopolitical and competitive impulses between India and China on the other hand. So we all know that the India-China bilateral, it contains various components like the trade relationship, the strategic competition, cultural exchanges, military interaction, foreign policy conduct, and so on. There are over 30 dialogue mechanisms at various levels. They serve a variety of functions. They facilitate military dialogues. They sustain business relationships, enable the conduct of foreign relations, and also facilitate cultural interactions and people-to-people ties. Now, some of these elements of the bilateral are influenced by other elements, but some elements retain a certain independence or immunity from changes in the others. So for instance, trade relations, they seem to be relatively impervious to geopolitical dynamics or political dynamics. And the trade deficit, for instance, has grown to its widest without interruption over the last 5 years, when political relations were at their lowest. And on the other hand, cultural relations appear to be much more susceptible to disruption when political relations become difficult. So finding the appropriate balance between these elements is a difficult task, especially when uncertainty and instability is a constant in the bilateral. So this interaction or this balance between components is something I'll touch on repeatedly in my remarks. And something to remember when it comes to how these components influence each other is that the condition of stability in the border dispute and political relations sort of applies a limiting threshold on the scale and depth of most other elements in the bilateral relationship. I'll quote India's External Affairs Minister here, Dr. Jaishankar, who sort of, to illustrate my point, who warned in August 2022 that the state of the border will determine the state of the relationship. So as far as finding a balance is concerned, in both the Indian government and the Chinese government have determined, like all states do in a realist world, that sovereignty and territorial integrity are priorities that condition all other types of state-to-state interactions or even sub-state interactions. So over the last decade, we've seen armed confrontations over a disputed border. We've seen strategic competition in South Asia and more broadly in the global South. And these have directly affected the flow of cultural interactions. And we have made this observation in the episodes of Exchange Project, where we cover contemporary interactions. For instance, Confucius Institute, sister city agreements, I think Dr. Singh touched upon it briefly. They were vectors of cultural exchange that China had deployed in order to promote the language and culture. Sister city agreements like the one between Delhi and Beijing, Bangalore and Chengdu, they were designed to enable the development of business linkages between city governments in India and China. So Confucius Institutes operated fairly widely across the country, but they saw their impact diminish for reasons that pertain mainly to geopolitical considerations. So there were more than 15 Indian universities that signed MOUs with Chinese universities, and they were forced to halt their activities because these MOUs were placed under review. And the same thing with sister city agreements, which had a lot of promise, but they became dormant almost instantly. And this happened because the political climate created by Doklam and Galwan, coupled with the assessment of the central government that these institutions are vectors of influence operations. I mean, all of that meant that modes of cultural, academic, and people-to-people exchange have to be nested within the conditions of political exchange. So we know a cultural exchange is also facilitated by business interactions. And in the past, it was through the trade in silk, in cotton, porcelain, and other biological products. I think even sugar, Dr. Deepak has mentioned briefly. So today it takes slightly different forms. And this too, so for example, if you take the case of Chinese mobile phone applications and video games, they were banned and restricted for security reasons and sort of in a direct response to the border clashes. So on the one hand, these games and these sort of apps are, they're unique and youth-centric modes of promoting cultural exchange and understanding, but they're also unfortunately considered and perceived as instruments of statecraft. So for instance, if you speak to some voices from the sort of esports community and talent management companies in India for esports, they will tell you that the ban on PUBG influenced Indian gaming in a very negative way. But on the other hand, these games, again, like I mentioned, were considered instruments of statecraft that the central government felt had to be restricted. And for instance, there was a game that was released on the anniversary of the Galwan clash in 2023, a game released by Tencent called Undawn. And, it was a mock-up of the Galwan clash in some respects. And so there were calls for it being banned. And similarly, there's the 5-Win app scandal, which sort of attests to the security risks that are relating to Chinese digital economy products in India. So interestingly, at the Mamallapuram Informal Leadership Summit in 2019, both sides agreed to designate 2020 as the year of India-China cultural and people-to-people exchanges. But Galwan happened immediately after that, and competitive and political considerations at the highest level sort of impact cultural engagements, even when the cultural engagements are given a boost or an impetus at the highest level. So it isn't just about Confucius Institute, it isn't just about Chinese video games. We've seen academic exchanges and civil society engagements also slow to a trickle. Indian journalists in China returned after their visas were not renewed. Currently, I think only the Press Trust of India is allowed to operate from Beijing. Even think tank visits or academic exchanges between the two countries have suffered. But I think that the recent thaw in the bilateral relationship, it offers us an opportunity to observe how these linkages could be restored and how both parties are trying to strike a balance between these various competing considerations in the bilateral relationship. So you have the latest meeting between the Indian Foreign Secretary Vikram Misri and Sun Weitong in Beijing. It indicated that both sides have agreed to improve ties by resuming the Kailash Mansarovar Yatra, which was stalled since 2020. They've also discussed the possibility of resuming direct flights and exchange of journalists and reopening of bureaus and so on. So most of these discussions, as you can tell, are focused on enhancing people-to-people ties, and it perhaps reveals something important here, which is that maybe cultural relations and linkages are the first to be restored after some stability is attained in the political relationship, perhaps because the cost benefit analysis of allowing them or withdrawing from them is favorable for both sides. And academics and analysts from both countries have argued in favor of this, building up trust by promoting cultural interactions to facilitate greater understanding of thought processes and historical conditions. So, for instance, in India, some scholars have argued that think tank dialogues and exchange of professors is a way for intellectual elites to become a bridge for track one and official dialogues. And this builds rapport and is a step in the direction of normalizing relations. Others have advocated for issuing a limited number of visas for tourists visiting holy sites and greater student and academic education exchanges. So I think in this context, a track two dialogue that was held recently in Shanghai and Lhasa, along with the visit of academics in November last year, was a positive. There are also, I said recently, there was also a delegation of Indian school principals that visited China in December to promote people-to-people exchanges. So, and such exchanges are also something that you see scholars in China have also come out and supported. So, for example, Chang Chiatong in an article recently sort of argued for bridging the perception gap by promoting more exchanges. And he went even one step further, and he's argued that the lack of such cultural exchanges has contributed to the misunderstandings between India and China. So he's argued that, I quote, one atypical feature of this relationship is that when bilateral ties decline, cultural exchanges are often the most visibly affected. Even Liu Chongyi, he's argued that something similar, although he has placed the blame for diminished cultural relations entirely on India, stating that India cut off direct flights to China and India is restricting the issuance of visas to the Chinese people. Qianfang too has stated that since October 24, the warming of bilateral relations has resulted in the recovery of contacts in the field of cultural relations. And I have only presented a snippet of the views of Chinese strategic thinkers as expressed in the last few months pertaining to the cultural relations and geopolitical balance. A deeper analysis of the analysis of Chinese strategic thinkers continues to suffer from what Dr. Deepak has said is called the looking down on India syndrome, and he's he's explained this in much more detail and depth in his recent op-ed in the Sunday Guardian. And before I conclude, I'll just present a counterintuitive logic here, or a different take that are being presented by some scholars on the interaction between cultural relations and geopolitical relations. So some scholars have pointed out that cultural interactions continued even during Doklam, with tour groups traveling to China and Chinese citizens coming to India. So they argue that the periods of geopolitical and political tensions are only an occasional pause and only cause brief inactivity. But for the most part, these cultural relations have continued even during times of intense confrontation and competition. So this slightly counterintuitive logic, I think, applies partially, because if you look at the setbacks suffered in cultural relations during that time, they sort of outweigh the interactions that were actually taking place. I'll conclude here by stating that that striking the appropriate balance between cultural interactions, academic exchanges on the one hand, and then political relations at the highest level is a complicated task. States face all kinds of pressures, domestic, external, to maintain and minimize certain kinds of interactions. But again, perhaps this is a slightly self-interested view. Academic exchanges and people-to-people ties are necessary not just when bilateral relations require a boost, but it's something that must acquire a momentum and logic of their own. And at the same time, it would be unrealistic to expect that they are not conditioned by political circumstances of the time. So I think I'll conclude here, and I'll leave some more room for discussion in the Q&A session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Ratish.
Thank you, Rahul, for those comprehensive remarks. I think you've summed up the conflict in cultural interactions and geopolitical impulses quite efficiently. Thank you to all our speakers for such an engaging and insightful perspective. We've covered a lot of ground in this discussion, from historical legacies and their contemporary echoes to soft power dynamics and the geopolitical balancing of cultural interactions. As Dr. Deepak reminds us, the foundation of India-China exchanges runs very deep, shaped by centuries of intellectual, religious, artistic, and even language dialogue. They are stories that are still alive today, influencing everything from historical interactions to contemporary bilateral policies. The Gunjan helps us understand how soft power operates both as a bridge as well as a battleground, particularly in South and Southeast Asia, where India and China's cultural narratives often compete with each other. Rahul, as he mentioned, the delicate balance between cultural diplomacy and geopolitical realities is an engagement that can either facilitate deeper understanding or become entangled in strategic competition. So, where do we go on from here? First, we need to recognize that cultural exchanges are not just relics of the past. They are dynamic and evolving, shaped by modern intermediaries, students, artists, entrepreneurs, and even gamers. These are actors that play critical role in shaping the narratives, not just between both countries, but also in and around the geographical peripheries. Second, while cultural diplomacy can build bridges, it is, of course, not immune to geopolitical friction. This means how we frame and tell these stories actually matters. The more we engage with these histories, the more we move towards countering simplistic and one directional narratives about India China relations. And lastly, today's discussion, I think, makes it very clear that despite diplomatic and security tensions, cultural exchanges remain a parallel and an enduring domain of engagement beyond political fluctuations. With that, I think we can now move on to the Q&A session. But before we do that, I would like to take this moment to invite all of our participants to two exciting bookshops that ORCA is hosting this weekend. On Saturday, we'll be diving into crafting and deconstructing narratives, where participants will explore how stories shape perception and influence decision making across a range of domains. On Sunday, we'll shift gears to data visualization and analysis, a hands-on session led by Rahul, Karan, Reddy, designed to help you transform raw data into clear and compelling insights. Details of both the workshops can be found in the link shared in the chat box. Both workshops are great opportunities to build practical skills, and I encourage all of you to join in as only few seats remain. With that, I would like to open the floor for the Q&A session. I encourage all participants to use two methods mentioned earlier to ask their questions, either by typing them in the chat box or by raising your hand if you would like to ask them directly. Please keep your questions concise, relevant, and particularly to today's discussion, and kindly specify the speaker your question is addressed to. We'll begin the first round of questions from the panelist for the co-panelist and move on to the audience round after that. I would like to open the floor to all the speakers. In case you have a question for your co-panelist, please feel free to ask.
Okay, I just have a small question for Rahul. You made a very interesting point saying that even when there are geopolitical tensions, the people to people or the scholarly interactions should continue. As in the case of India, China, we saw post at least Galwan 2020. Obviously, COVID also played a role there because both happened like two back to back. So it's very difficult to figure out what went wrong there. But obviously, Galwan was the primary factor there. It's a total stop, right? We're still talking about it, starting people-to-people interaction and think tank interaction and scholarly visits. Given the history, right? Like we talk about India China having a historical connection. We do have that. Like there's no denying that. Like we have a huge diaspora here, Chinatowns and other aspects. But how do you think we go about doing that? Like, worked in multiple think tanks, so a little bit of a very strategic perspective there, because the training is little on that side. And also talking to the Chinese, like my argument always has been they follow the party's line to the T. Very rarely, in a very informal interactions, you get to hear a certain kind of, especially geopolitics. Let's talk about just governmental thing. I'm not talking about the other aspects. Have not interacted in the other field. So how do you see we can do that, and how is it possible, given the whole baggage of India-China relations? We I still don't see our relations absolutely smooth. We are just waiting for something to go wrong always, and something does go wrong always. And there are too many roadblocks in this relationship. And we're trying to work. Both governments have put effort. I think the 70th anniversary, there were some 70 events planned, 35 in India and 35 in China. I think hardly any happened. Obviously, COVID, and then Galwan took the thing. This is the 75th year of the diplomatic establishment, and I don't know how many events are planned this time, not in the think tank circuit anymore. So, but obviously there would be a lot of talk. It has its thing. But how do you see that we do that? Just I know it's a very not a very polished question, but I'm just thinking, how do we go about doing that?
If I could, Ratish, answer the question directly. Yeah. So I think, yeah, it's not there's no straightforward way of going about this. Obviously, the point of the academic exchanges is that a dialogue below the state-to-state level continues, even if perhaps at times it feels futile and it feels repetitive of the party line or even the stated government position. Perhaps it is important to have that dialogue for the sake of the dialogue itself. And also, from my limited interactions with Chinese scholars over the last year and a half, 2 years, you find that they do tend to speak a little more freely in conferences and academic events. So again, it could be. It probably depends on context and what kind of events are taking place. So I found that probably in conferences and academic events, perhaps maybe on stage they may not be as free with what they're saying, but on a personal level, when you do interact with them, they do tend to say a few interesting things and give you a few insights. So I think that keeps the conversation going, and I think it's important to have that channel in the first place, even if it is just for the sake of it, even if the party line, even if the government line is just being repeated. Keeping that open, I think, is relevant for the sake of doing it, at least.
Any other question by any of the other panelists?
I think if I could, I have one question for Dr. Deepak and one for Dr. Gunjan, if that's okay. So, Dr. Deepak, you had mentioned about how the Chinese are more aware of Indian tradition, Indian society, Indian customs. So, what does this say about the sort of historiographical tradition of both countries? And it would be great to hear your thoughts on how history is recorded in the first place by each country, and how perhaps that has an effect on how much we know about each other. And also a second question, slightly related, but more to do with the translation project that you were talking about. Can we expect any progress on this front, given the thaw in bilateral relations of late? I think that was my questions for Dr. Deepak. I'll probably wait and then I'll ask Dr. Singh.
Yeah, we'll just go one by one for each question.
Yeah, okay. I think, as far as the historical records are concerned, of course, they need to be taken with a pinch of salt, because after all, they are the official historiography, written by China. And from, certain perspective, I quote historians. So that is one thing. But I think, as far as you can say the recognition and say the familiarity with Indian thought system and Indian tradition. I think Chinese, they are more, aware about this. And naturally, of course, the Buddhist connection is one thing which everyone knows. And it is in the process of this, Buddhist connection, or rather umbrella, that a series of, Indian knowledge systems. So they also traveled to China, and they are still there, and of course most of the intellectuals, those who look into those, so they are aware about that, and it's not only the ordinary Chinese. So they find it problematic. For example, if you say the kind of influence Sanskrit had on China, it is massive. So their own studies, which is also quoted in my book, they said that even today, so 35,000 Chinese words, so they are of Sanskrit origin. So this is one thing, and also, you can say the kind of impact it had on vernacularization of Chinese, and the kind of effect or influence it had on changing the literal Chinese, which used to be monosyllabic, into polysyllabic language. So it is all from India, from Sanskrit tradition. But then, of course, very few people they know about. For example, Shije, right? This world. This is basically a Sanskrit term, from Loka. The Chinese, they never have this Shije concept. It is only the Buddhist concept and then the Indian concept. And there are many examples like that. So that's why I'm saying that this translation tradition, which happened at a huge scale in China, so that was continued by later scholarship, so be it the modern Chinese scholarship or the contemporary Chinese scholarship. You see the kind of work they have done. Forget about the mainstream Indian literature or academic works, but they have also rendered, these English writings in India. The writers of English language like Nepal, even Bikram Seth, various other people, including Amrit Desai and all. So they have done research on these people. So not only the Sanskrit, not only the Hindi, not only the Urdu, you feel the Urdu, even Premchand, Gulzar, and so many other people. So they have done thorough research on these people. So this tradition has been continued, and it has never stopped there. It is unfortunate from Indian side, of course. I think we may blame it on to sinology in India and people like us, so those who didn't do a good job. But then I think comparing us, they have done much better job, and that reflects also, the kind of knee-jerk reaction our government have on, these geopolitical contestations. As a result of Galvan, a project signed by 2 prime ministers, so it gets stalled in. And it's still not happening. I have written so many mails to various, organizations, but it doesn't work. I hope it works. It becomes one of the, perhaps the, one of the things which could be part of the 75th anniversary of India-China relations. And we have done most of the work. My team, so we have done most of the work. But I think the problem is at the policy formulation level. So that's why I'm saying that, why geopolitics and this cultural diplomacy, it goes hand in hand, right? For example, I'll take you back to 1947. So when we formulated our policies on Tibet, it was half-hearted. It was neither here nor there, right? And we were directionless, in which way we are going. Whether we are going to stick to 1914 Shimla Convention, which we reached with the Tibetans, or we accept it as a part of China, right? And that created a lot of problem. We wanted to adhere to Shimla Agreement, but at the same time, we accepted it as a part of China. It will not work. Diplomacy doesn't work that way. And same thing is, post-Galvan, trade alone. That's why my argument, trade is okay, but other things not okay. So this creates problems, right, for both the countries. Anyway, I'll stop here.
And just one quick question, Ratish, if
Sure,
that's
Rahul.
okay.
Sure. Go ahead.
Yeah, for just a question for Dr. Gunjan Singh. So, you mentioned that in South Asia, India has sort of inherent advantages. It brings to mind two public opinion surveys that we've done over the last 2 years at ORCA in Nepal. So I went there last year to do the survey, and this year my colleague Omkar was there to do the survey there. And I think some of the results may be of interest to you. I would encourage you to go and review it if it's of interest, especially as it pertains to the importance of public diplomacy. And you mentioned education, Indian education institutions. So it brought one statistic to mind, at least in the context of Nepal. I think last year, I think the tertiary education destination, the preferences expressed by Nepali students for seeking a tertiary education, sort of India was ranked second until 2022 or 2023, and then it dropped off to third. And we tend not to notice this sort of slow erosion of sort of India's preeminence in these subsectors across South Asia. And I wonder if you could sort of elaborate on these factors, on this slow erosion that might be taking place, and how soft power sort of, or public diplomacy rather, figures in that picture.
Thanks for the question. Nepal obviously is one of the very interesting aspects of. I just had a discussion in January on China-India contestation kind of a thing in Nepal, and where we are doing good or bad. And Professor Muni was on the panel, so obviously it's a very again, as I think it's a summary. Nepal would be a good example, or I should say, an case study of the soft power and how Chinese are making inroads. Obviously, Nepal has aspirations. It's a sovereign state. India and Indian, as I've consistently argued, especially primarily from a very geopolitical perspective, that we've made big promises in the region. We fail to deliver it on time, and Chinese deliver it on time. So China is attractive. Chinese money is attractive, and but as I've said, on the ground there are new challenges that are emerging. If you look at the education as well, I don't know how true or credible it is, but there were reports that the Chinese have bought most of the media in Nepal today. So it's very difficult to write anti-Chinese narrative in the Nepalese media. Plus, they're pushing for Mandarin to be mandatory in schools still, I think 5th or 6th standard, I don't know. So the teachers would definitely come from China, or they will be trained in China in order to teach, and all that ground problems are there. And as I've discussed, education, India was a destination for a number of South Asian students. And when we were students in JNU, and even today, there are a lot of students from Nepal, Afghanistan, Sri Lanka who still come to study here. But we need to work on that. As I've said, the dilapidated infrastructure, the total, we'll get into a rant about how public institutions are not doing too well when they can be a very prominent tool of soft power, which we had, and we are losing a grip on it because Chinese have the advantage. They're able to give better scholarships. Their infrastructure is better. Obviously, all that keys into a student coming from Nepal, where you get a better infrastructure and a better scholarship than coming to India, which is more affordable. So India is still technically slightly more affordable in the sense that we are close, we have cultural to cultural ties. It's more like not moving to a foreign country. Maybe in multiple cases, it's easy to move back and forth from home. But China definitely has the advantage. If you get a chance to or a scholarship to study in a Tsinghua kind of, or a Peking University, which ranks almost up in the top 50 or top 10 in the world, why will you not take that? So the Indian government, as I've said, have failed to encash on it. If you would have pushed the things, then obviously India does provide scholarship. We do provide a lot of scholarship for students coming from Afghanistan, Nepal, Sri Lanka. We have the South Asian University here. though the last few news coming out of there have not been very positive, but definitely a success of SARC and how an institution was built, and there was a vision at least for how educational interactions can be put ahead. So all that, as I've said again, like obviously India has been lagging behind, but if you see the narratives may be built around after the establishment of the Pokhara airport, or why the Chinese funded it, why substandard construction happened, and India refused. But then India is refusing them to the use of Indian airspace, right, which is crucial for the success of Pokhara as well. So geopolitics does come in play again. But obviously, most of the Nepalese leader, even today, are the ones who have been educated here, right? So they have certain connections. States still have, it's called roti beti connection across the border. So all that is there. But as I've said, the Chinese money has been attractive. China has pushed it, but they tend to weaponize it. If the party learns how to de-link it even slightly from these, the Chinese have a good space to encash their soft power, which they have the capability to. India, on the other hand, has multiple avenues to encash it, but is just not looking keen to do that. That's what. And Nepal is, I think, the biggest example of it. We have familial relation across the border. If you have people coming from the state of Bihar, they have families across the border. So that kind of a ground strength that we have, and even, but obviously the 2017 the barricade, and then Chinese saying that we will provide you fuel. They can, but the cost is going to be humongous. We are at the advantage. It's a geographical advantage that India and Nepal have, which China cannot bridge it. Like, even if it wants it, the Himalayas are right there. But all that is, China talks benign, tries to exploit on the enmity or road bumps that come in India-Nepal relations. And obviously, educationally, they have the advantage. Like, I'll say that we should push for a better infrastructure scholarship, which we do, but it's just that we don't know how to package it as Chinese have done it too well. Thank you. That's all. I think I can ramble on it for a long time. It's very, but yeah, this is a good case study of India, China, Nepal. Is a good case study of how China has made inroads in South Asia, definitely. But as I say, they don't know how to de-link it. The party does get involved, and it's that's where the problem starts to begin.
Just a quick
Yes.
comment, what Gunjan said in just 2 sentences, if I may be permitted.
Sure, sure.
One, I think China was never in this kind of advantage, which it is now. And I see there are 2 reasons for that. One, of course, being a big power, a big giant, surrounded by these smaller powers. So we took our cultural affinity with these powers for granted. So that is one thing. And then, of course, China capitalized on that. So when it emerged strong. And second thing, which is even more important than this, is we failed to integrate, economically. Cultural integration, of course, we have taken it for granted that is there. But then economically, we failed to integrate. I think this is a big failure, on our part. Not only in South Asia, but also in our, extended neighborhood, say Southeast Asia. And I think as long as you are not integrated economically, your soft power or your hard power, sharp power, whatever you call it, it is it will not be in your interest, right? And China, I think, capitalized on it, irrespective of the fact that they have huge problems, with Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you, Dr. Deepak. With that, I think we've come to an end to the panelist Q&A session. We have a couple of questions, more than a couple of questions in the chat box directed towards the panelist. The first one is for Dr. Deepak. Based on your discussions with Chinese scholars and the general public in recent years, how would you assess the evolving perception of India-China cultural relations or the importance of these ties? Have you observed any emerging trend in how these ties are valued in China?
I think as far as cultural relations, especially people-to-people relations between India and China are concerned, so China has always been for it, and they have been very you can say enthusiastic about it. The scholarship, those who are engaged in Indian studies, so they are even more enthusiastic about it, and also the other people, those who are working on India. So whether they are scholars of Sanskrit, whether they are scholars of Hindi, or whether they are scholar of so just Chinese, but looking at India. So all of them, they are interested to engage in dialogue, which Rahul was pointing to, the conversation with India, irrespective of the political differences or geopolitical contestations. They have never let it down. And I think it is, you can say, the confidence of a rising power, which I think is lacking in India at this point in time. That is, making this happen. Therefore, we see even after Galwan, for Chinese, they also suffered equal number of casualties, sometimes maybe even more than us. But they never stopped this dialogue. They never stopped academic exchange. I visited China many times, of course, not during COVID, but after that. In 2023, I started to visit. 24, I visited. So therefore, it never stopped. But then for Chinese to come to India, everything, came to a grinding halt. Beside trade, of course, Indian traders, naturally, China benefits from that. So they will not stop them.
Second question is also directed to you, Dr. Deepak. It's based out of your book, India and China Beyond the Binary, in which you discuss the lack of mutual understanding between India and China, with China looking down on India and India not viewing China in a favorable light. From a policy perspective, how do you think this issue can be addressed in the current context of India-China relations?
I think it will continue, because we have to prepare for that. And to be very frank, in geopolitical contestation, the one who has upper hand, so they will behave like this. I think power essentially it is expansionist. We have to come to terms with this, and China is behaving like any expansionist power. Therefore, if India is not been able to match up with China, we should not be expecting China to, act nicely with us. I think no one does that. Therefore, we need to, you can say, formulate our policy in such a way, integrate the neighborhood in such a way, and prop up our economic growth rate. And I think that will translate into our comprehensive national strength, the Chinese call it. And then, of course, the respectability with that. I think China has earned it. Otherwise, US also never used to bother about China. It also used to look down upon China, right? But only when it matched technologically, economically, militarily, that earned that respect. I think India should follow the same route.
We also have a question for Dr. Singh. I'll just read it out for you, Dr. Singh. How do gender dynamics shape India-China soft power interactions in South and Southeast Asia? In what ways do cultural exchange, media representation, or policy initiatives reflect and reinforce gendered narratives in this contestation? This question is from Tishala.
Yes, I'm a little confused where to begin to answer this question. If we look at the gender issues, both countries are definitely, we are Asian nations. There are gender challenges. We've had the Me Too movement. China had its own issues with the Me Too movement and how it was restrictive and stuff like that. If you look at the government, obviously the Politburo, the CCP has come against continuous argument that it is very patriarchal. There's no space for women representation. There have been, I think, one or two women leaders in China till date who've risen to slightly top higher ranks. In India, it's slightly better, we can say that. But as a soft power exchanges, obviously the issues do have an impact because if you look at the thing in China going on, the declining marriage rate, the declining birth rate, the statements made by Xi Jinping at the World Conference for Women that women should redefine their role and get married and have kids. And obviously the party needs women because I think recently also there's a push by the offices that anybody at a marriageable age should get married. And like, I think you cannot decide not to get married. The policies that are very top down again, as I say in China, they try and solve societal issues. I agree they're doing other things, but there's a lot of push. In India, we still have the initiative Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. So it definitely reflects what is the problem with women in academia and other things. Obviously, I say it's still a challenge to live and stuff. So if you look at the whole feminist discourse, it's very different and or very similar and different in both the countries to a very large extent. We have, but cultural exchanges, obviously, India has pushed a lot of idea taking from the religious and other aspects about gender equality or power and empowerment of women and things like that, which can be reinforced. But policy initiatives haven't worked primarily on these lines. I don't look at it, but if you look at the Bollywood and other media initiatives, they do push a certain kind of a very patriarchal image kind of a thing. We contest that domestically as well, because that's the kind of narrative we are fed if you consuming the same content that you are exporting globally and stuff like that. So this is something which I think it needs some time looking into it, but definitely there are gender problems, and this is a region which struggles with similar issues. And cultural I'll say the policy initiatives domestically do reflect the challenges domestically that we are facing. Cultural exchanges, obviously, if you look at the media and the Bollywood and other things, do reinforce a certain kind of an idea, which the Chinese movies and media and series also reflect a similar thing, because that's what domestically is consumed there as well. So I think that challenge continues. This is a larger debate which needs to be rooted in a whole feminist discourse and the movements that have emerged, at least in the last 10 years, and how gender is becoming central, because a lot of strategic and global policies, you tend to see how they impact the women and other participants. Like I did a minor study on the Indo-Pacific policies and how they're talking about environment and gender and women and the marginalized communities. So obviously, when you look at soft power, we also have to see if they have primary policies of giving fellowships to girls and women and what kind of a thing that follows from there. So this definitely needs a proper study in order to be answered in a more correct fashion. That's all I can say. Thank you.
Definitely, Dr. Gunjan, I would like to reiterate what you just mentioned. Feminism in China is a growing discourse in the past 5 to 10 years. Some of the work that we do at ORCA does focus on that kind of evolution, that kind of change that is not just visible within the party, but also visible within the entertainment industry, for instance. So there's also another question for Rahul. The question is meant for Rahul. How has the shifting influence of Chinese video games like PUBG in India reflected the broader dynamics of bilateral relations and China's soft power strategy?
Thank you, Ratish. So the question of the video games, I think, is important to look beyond the PUBG example. Obviously, hugely popular for and influential in Indian gaming community. But it may be important to go a level deeper than just PUBG, because there are so many Chinese games in India that have been developed by Chinese developers, some by Singaporean ones. The most important one, I think, is Genshin Impact, which is a very popular Chinese game, and that sort of tells the story of China really well, and it's been deconstructed a lot by analysts. Some of these games, they tell the story of how well some of these digital economic goods have been localized and transmitted into India, and how and what a good job they've really done with customizing the product to suit Indian consumer appetite and preferences. Because the way the games are designed, the themes, the motifs of those games, Clash of Kings, Clash of Titans, there's a list of 40 to 50 ones, and they're incredibly popular. People, Indian gaming community is willing to spend money on it through in-game and in-app purchases. So it has become incredibly popular, and whether it reflects the broader dynamics, it did at one point. We did see that they became a casualty of the political sort of relations, the deterioration in political relations. But the interesting thing is they adapted very quickly and came up with sort of workarounds in order to continue to exist in the Indian market. So most of these games you will still find because you can still download it through the APK file, but also because the Chinese sort of if Tencent is responsible for is the sort of distributor for PUBG, Tencent has basically taken a backseat and allowed the South Korean company to take up the publishing and the distribution rights while it continues to be developed by a Chinese game studio. So there have been workarounds and sort of ways in which these products continue to exist. And perhaps you can't say the same about Indian products in the Chinese market. For example, we did a story on Oyo and the story of how the company basically entered the Chinese market but struggled to also remain in the market entirely for a long period of time. I think they were there for 3 years and then just completely left because they failed to sort of localize properly. They failed to understand consumer preferences in China. So I think that too reflects the sort of condition of cultural relations, that there is an insufficient understanding of the Chinese business sort of environment, also how consumers and people think there. And yeah, gaming is I think just one example of sort of the broader bilateral reflection of the broader bilateral relationship, and you could apply it to the other way also.
Just
to
to
add, sure.
to add to this, if I may be allowed, I think this is, I would say, my envy about Chinese, or the beauty of the Chinese. So what they do, so they would cynicize things, right? The Indian things, the way they cynicize Buddhism, the way they cynicized, and they package it and then sell it as their own product with various Chinese characteristics. I think this is quite important to understand, whether it is people-to-people dialogue, relations, or even their products. For example, this Sumoku, the black myth. I think that is also very, very popular, and this is the Indian content in there. And also recently made movie this Nachai. So that again, it has Indian content. Of course, I have not researched into that, but one of my colleagues from Doon University and my PhD student, so he wrote one article. He does on cinema. I think if you require, his inputs about cinema, how it is interconnecting two people, so you can perhaps reach out to him, and then would be great.
Definitely, Dr. Deepak. I was actually about to mention the Black Myth game and the connection that it has to India, because it's not just a popular game in India, but across the world. Another point, just to add to the question on the gaming question, me and Rahul have been working on that specific summary for some time, and we knew from the beginning that it was going to become a popular summary, popular article. The concept behind that, while we were discussing amongst each other, was that even though the Chinese games became collateral damage, it did end up creating a full industry of gamers in India. and the ripple effects are not just about India-China ties, but also there are domestic implications to some of these things that go beyond geopolitical tensions. So I think we've had a very engaging conversation. We are slightly over past time, but I think there's one question that is not related to the discussion, but would benefit all of our participants. Nitin Dhiman has asked a question about studying, having the option of choosing between the French or Chinese language. I'll take the liberty of answering that question, and if anyone else wants to join in, please please feel free to do so. I think there is no doubt that India-China ties are always going to be in demand, uh, be it geopolitical compulsions, be it cultural contact. Knowing the Chinese language is something that is always going to require more and more and more students. So, if given a choice to choose between the Chinese or French language, I would definitely say, from a policy perspective, from a perspective of somebody working in a think tank industry, is that do definitely choose the Chinese language. With that, I think if there are no more questions, we'll wrap this discussion. This has been a very insightful conversation, to be very honest. I think today's session leaves us all with new perspectives and questions about how these cultural interaction continue to shape India-China relations in ways that go beyond politics and borders. I would like to thank all our speakers for today's enriching conversation. I would like to thank the audience, and most importantly, I would like to thank Team ORCA for conducting this webinar very smoothly. Thank you all of you for joining us today, and hopefully we will continue these discussions in different forums.
Thank you. We would also like to thank ORCA for organizing such a